If one classical composer could be said to have created the soundtrack of the Second World War, it would have to be Ludwig van Beethoven. His music was played far more than that of any other classical composer everywhere, on both sides. In London, at the wartime proms, he was by far the most performed composer, followed, oddly enough, by Wagner, and with Elgar a long way down the list as the leading British composer. In Paris, the Swiss composer Arthur Honegger very bravely wrote an article protesting at the endless Beethoven cycles that were foisted on the French public. We've got Les Ondes was the house magazine of the collaborationist radio station Radio Paris, and on the right-hand side is a program for one of these Beethoven cycles conducted by Willem Mengelberg. But Beethoven was performed everywhere in the darkest places and the darkest times. Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, who happily is still with us and living in London, a very remarkable woman. I recommend her book, Inherit the Truth, and she writes very movingly in this book about the experience she had as the cellist of the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra, and how on one occasion she played this string arrangement of the Beethoven Pathetique, and what an uplifting experience this was. Around the same time, Janina Baumann, she's a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, and she describes in her book how she came across some 78 RPM records of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and it was starving and freezing, but these people got together in the ruins of a house in the Warsaw Ghetto and played again and again these 78s of Beethoven. Now, the Nazis were very proud of the Austro-German tradition of classical music. They regarded it as their trump card in the cultural propaganda war. This was their great cultural weapon, and they saw it as a weapon against the barbarous and uncultured Anglo-Saxon nations. England was Das Land ohne Musik, and the country without music. And in November 1939, Hitler made a speech in which he claimed that one German, Beethoven, gave more to the world than all the British in history. That was his claim. So it was desperately irritating to the Germans that Beethoven was appropriated by the BBC as part of their war against the Axis powers. Somebody had the brilliant idea that the opening motto motif of the Fifth Symphony, da-da-da-dum, is of course the Morse code for V, and the result was this. So that was a broadcast to the French resistance from London. And I love the fact that to convince the French listeners that this is really coming from London, we have another piece of music that was not written by an English composer, but by Georg Friedrich Händel, to pronounce his name correctly. There's a wonderful description of Goebbels' reaction to seeing a propaganda movie produced in this country during the war, which I'm sure, I think everybody here is old enough, probably, to have seen this at some point or other. And it's footage from the Triumph of the Will, which is doctored to make the Nazi hierarchy dance the Lambeth Walk. And apparently when Goebbels saw this, he had a monumental, screaming temper tantrum, throwing over chairs and pretty well chewing the carpet. And I imagine his reaction to my next little excerpt might have been quite similar. Now, the subject of popular music has been brought up a couple of times, and anybody, I think, who is old enough to have lived through the Second World War, if you ask them about this, they'll tell you that it is actually the popular music of the time that evokes memories of the war most intensely. Vera Lynn in this country, Zara Leander in Germany, And if there's a musician who could be said to have written the popular soundtrack of the Second World War, it's probably Glenn Miller. And on the popular music front, you could say that the Americans had won the war before it started. It's in the interwar period that American popular culture, through movies, through radio, through electric recordings, and particularly in the late 30s, through the creation of swing. And I would claim swing as one of the most powerful, emotive propaganda weapons of the Second World War. It was so powerful, there was nothing that Goebbels or anybody else could do about it. Most authoritarian rulers, not just the Nazis, but Stalin as well, hated swing because swing, there's something about it. It's an expression, I suppose, of youthful rebellion. It's something that's very difficult to control. And so I'm going to play you two little excerpts from Glenn Miller's In the Mood. First of all, a French recording made in Paris in 1941 with Alex Colombel. So it's Dans l'ambiance in this version. And then we're going to hear, this is very weird, this is a band made up of members of the German Wehrmacht playing in, I'm not quite sure, it's probably in der Stimmung in German. And this is a broadcast from Radio Belgrade in 1943. I think the squeeze box there does detract slightly from the sophisticated big band sound. So, as I said, a love of jazz and a love of swing was often a way of registering resistance, I think, in occupied countries. And this is particularly true in France, where you had this these youth movement, the Zazou, who dressed in a kind of special uniform. Now, the Nazis realized they could not suppress swing because one of the most fundamental urges of everybody of military age in the Second World War was the desire to dance. In fact, for a short time, the Vichy regime tried to forbid public dancing, but that proved to be absolutely impossible. They strongly disapproved of it. The prefect of the Côte d'Azur actually passed a law saying that the word swing was not to be used in public. And this caused enormous problems with songs that had swing in the title or in the words. This is a photograph from a Vichy or a Nazi propaganda magazine of Americans learning to dance. And I think that photograph is being used to try and say that this is something animalistic and barbaric, the dancing to this kind of music. But so swing, I think, of all types of music in the Second World War, was the one that was most consciously used as a weapon. And Glenn Miller broadcast to the Wehrmacht. They had the so-called Wehrmacht hour towards the end of the war. I think this was to try and convince German soldiers that it was best to put down their arms and probably surrender to the Americans rather than to wait for the Russians to arrive. So here's a little excerpt of Glenn Miller mangling the German language, trying to talk to German troops and win them over. The Nazis had a particular problem with jazz and swing on ideological grounds. Obviously, jazz, American popular jazz, the popular version, is a product of its Afro-American origins, but popular music in America was very much the creation of, very often of Jews of Russian origin. It's difficult, apart from Cole Porter, it's difficult to think of a major American popular composer of this period who was not of Eastern European Jewish origin. So this was the ultimate horrible cocktail as far as the Germans were concerned. But Goebbels really had to swallow, this was a bitter pill to swallow, he felt he needed to do it. And they put together a jazz band that was probably the best band in Europe during the Second World War. They picked up musicians from all over occupied Europe, from Holland, from Croatia, from Italy, and so on. Often they were people, they were so-called Halbjuden, or people who were, as far as the Nazis were concerned, were racially impure, and they were saved from the death camps by being willing to play in this band. And they took popular American hits, usually by Jewish composers, and they added propaganda words. Now, the one I'm going to play to you is quite harmless. I listened to a number before when I was putting this talk together, and believe me, listening to 3 or 4 of them really does your brain in. And there was one, it was just so appalling, I thought, I don't think I can play that. It's just too awful. It was an anti-Semitic version of Eddie Cantor's song, Making Whoopee. This particular propaganda song, it was going to make you laugh, I know, but you're only going to laugh because it's so fantastically unfunny in a clod-hopping Teutonic way. That's a really good band there at the end, but the Germans weren't going to win the war that way, that's for sure. Now, we're going to see how far I get with time, but my intention is to talk about 3 female musical characters who crossed sides and did good service on both sides in the war, and the Merry Widow, Madame Butterfly, and Lily Marlene. Now, I think it's often forgotten how popular operetta was. It was almost, well, actually, I would say as popular as swing. It was everywhere. Again, it was on Broadway. They were doing endless operetta revivals. London, there were special operetta performances put on to entertain the guards in Auschwitz to keep up their spirits for the hard work that they were doing. And the Nazis had a problem with operetta. They loved it, but most operetta composers were Jewish, or their librettists were. And in fact, the only real exception to that is, in fact, he's not an exception. It's Franz Lehár. He himself was not Jewish, but his wife was, and so were all the people he collaborated with, all his main librettists through his career. Here is Lehár with Goebbels. He enjoyed the special protection of Goebbels. On one occasion, the SS came to take his wife away, and he had Goebbels' personal number, and he was able to ring Goebbels and hand the phone over to the SS so that they would leave his wife alone. Now, I think when it really came down to it, Hitler and Goebbels preferred the Merry Widow to Die Meistersinger. Hitler was, you just had to think of Hitler in his bunker humming along to the Merry Widow waltz, because that's what he really liked. In fact, he took time off to go to 6 performances of a single run of the Merry Widow with the handsome Dutch tenor Johannes Heesters, who died recently, completely unrepentant of his association with Hitler at the age of 108. But here he is, at the time, singing Danilo's entrance from the Merry Widow. This is the long-running, hugely successful production of Merry Widow with Jan Kapoor and Martha Egert that was one of the great successes in New York during the war. This was hugely successful in London with the Australian Cyril Richard and Madge Elliott, and they took it on tour. They took the Merry Widow on tour all the way through the Mediterranean war zone, across North Africa. This is them in Cairo, and they landed up in Tel Aviv. And that, I mean, it's so bizarre to think of, well, I'm sure there were many people, refugees from Austria and Germany in Tel Aviv who shed a tear over these performances. But there was, as I said, Lehár still alive and under the personal protection of Goebbels.